In this session, we will be looking at the United Kingdom. No, not that United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom of Israel. We'll be taking a look at three main figures of Saul, David, and Solomon. In the last time period, the nation of Israel moved into the promised land where they were governed by judges. They were in a cycle where the people did evil. They were oppressed by another nation, and they cried out to God for help. He would then raise up a judge to save them, and the judge would deliver them from their enemies, and then the people and the land would live in rest until they began to do evil again. We saw how the nation got worse and worse, with every man doing what was right in his own eyes. They were clearly in need of someone to lead them in the ways of God. Now the final judge was Samuel. One day the elders of Israel came to him and asked for a king, just like the other nations. They said, we see this in 1 Samuel chapter 8. They said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. Now this was not the way that God had set up the kingdom of Israel. He was to be their king. He was to be the head. But he knew that one day they would want to be like the other nations, with a human king. And so in Deuteronomy, which is in the period of Egypt and the Exodus, just before the people of Israel moved into the promised land, God set out instructions for what a king should look like. So I'm just going to read those to you. So this is in Deuteronomy chapter 17. It says, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen. You shall set as a king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by carefully observing all the words of the law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. So there are a few guidelines set out in that passage, a few do's and a few don'ts. So the king over Israel is supposed to be one that the Lord chooses. They're supposed to be one from among the nation of Israel. So that's their guidelines for choosing. And then there's instructions for how this king should operate. So he's not supposed to multiply horses for himself. Horses would have represented military power. God is still their protector. God still wants to be the one to lead them into battle, to give them victory. So he's not to multiply horses and rely on the strength of men to win their battles. He is not to greatly multiply wives for himself. So this was a common practice in those days of the kings of nations would take many wives, and often it was building alliances with the other nations. It was a political thing. But the Lord knew that if there were foreign women coming who would be close to the king's heart, that they would turn the king's heart away to their gods so that he would not worship Yahweh, the true God. And he was not to multiply silver or gold for himself. He wasn't to seek after riches, but to rely again on the Lord. And then there were two things that he was to do. He was to write a copy of the law and to read it all the days of his life, to keep the word of the Lord close to his heart so that he would not depart from it, so that he could live in the ways of God and live in relationship with God, and to lead the people in that as well. So the people asked for a king. And how did God respond? He said, "They have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day that I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods." We see this in 1 Samuel chapter 8. God was Israel's king. They were to be different from the nations around them, to represent God to the other nations. And as we see in the covenant with Abraham, to be a blessing to the other nations. Imagine how God would have felt. He was the one who had done so much for them. He had fathered them. He had protected them. He had led them out of slavery. He had taken this unruly, disorganized group of people and he had turned them into a nation. And then they said that they didn't want him to be their head anymore. They wanted a human king. It must have broken his heart. But he said to Samuel, he said, "Give the people what they want." And so Samuel, the last judge, appointed Israel's first king, who is Saul. And so the nation of Israel went from a theocracy with God at the head to a monarchy with a man at the head. When Samuel chose Saul, he looked really good from the world's standards. We see in 1 Samuel chapter 9 that he was wealthy, he was handsome, he was a good choice for king. And Saul had many opportunities to live in the ways of God. But eventually he became prideful and his heart turned against God. He thought that doing things his own way would be better, and he tried to justify disobedience. This wasn't what God had set out for the kings at all. We see a really clear example of this in 1 Samuel chapter 15. The Lord had instructed Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites. But Saul and the people spared Agag, who is their king, and the best of the sheep and the oxen, and of the fattened calves and the lamb, and all that was good, and would not destroy them. So already he's disobeying the Lord. He's doing what seems right, what most of the kings would have done, but it wasn't what God had commanded. So when Samuel confronted Saul about his disobedience, Saul tried to justify his actions. He said that they saved the best of the livestock so that they could make an offering to God. This didn't satisfy Samuel because the Lord wanted his obedience more than the sacrifice. He's like, "But I told you not to. So why would you think that I want a sacrifice from those things?" So Saul tried to justify his disobedience to Samuel, but Samuel knew, and the Lord knew, that that wasn't the case. They weren't fooled. And so Saul tried to blame his disobedience on the people next. He said, "Oh, it was the people that took the livestock." But again, the Lord wasn't fooled, and Samuel wasn't fooled. Eventually, Saul admitted his sin, and then requested that he be honored before the people. So we have no way of knowing how sincere his repentance really was, but the fact that he asked to be honored before the people for what he had done shows us that maybe that wasn't the truth in his heart, and the fact that it took 3 tries for him to get it right. So at this time, the Lord rejected Saul from being king because Saul had rejected the word of the Lord. He had chosen to go his own way, very deliberately. And so, he no longer had the covering of the Lord in the position of king. So the Lord sent Samuel to seek another king. And this one was David. Unlike Saul, who drew people's attention, when David was anointed as king, God told Samuel not to look at appearance. God was looking for someone whose heart was toward him, and he found that in David, who was the youngest son and a shepherd. In those days, birth order was really important. The eldest son would inherit the largest portion so that they would have everything that they needed to govern and to take care of the rest of the family. David would have been the last in line to inherit. He had no real standing in this family. The shepherd was the lowest of low positions. It was the worst job you could have. It was a job that had to be done because sheep were essential to the ancient Near Eastern society. But it was really looked down upon. Shepherds were loners. They spent all their days out in the back pasture with the sheep, and they stank like the sheep. They were the lowest people in society. And so this shows so much about God's character, that he wasn't looking for external perfection, but for somebody who would walk humbly with him. He chose someone who, in the eyes of the world, really was in no way fit to be king. And he raised him up to lead his people towards him. Under the rule of David, it was known as Israel's glory days. David was known as a man after God's own heart. Yeah, he sinned, but ultimately his heart was soft towards the Lord. David was not perfect by any means. In 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, we see how he got another man's wife pregnant and then murdered that man to cover it up. Or he had him murdered. But when he was confronted about it by Nathan the prophet, he realized his sin and he repented. And we can actually see his humble response in Psalm 51, which he wrote after this had happened. So this is in such contrast to Saul, who tried to justify and blame others for his sin. David realized that what he had done had hurt the Lord's heart, and he'd hurt other people. And he wholeheartedly repented. He wept over what he had done. We see that David wrote a lot of the Psalms. We see that he had a very honest relationship with God. He would pour out his heart before the Lord in every kind of circumstance. He always had faith in the character of God, even in the darkest places of his life. When he had been betrayed and was being hunted down, he praised God. At one point, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we see that David wants to make a temple for God. He said, God, you've given us this city, you've given us this land. We're protected, we're solid, but you're still living in a tent. I want to make you a house, a permanent place for you to dwell. But God responded, and this is what we see. He says, I will also appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may live in their own place and not be disturbed again. Nor will the wicked afflict them any more as formerly. Even from that day as I commanded the judges to be over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. So we see that the nation of Israel is planted. They're in Jerusalem. And then the Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and with the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. So David had said to God, he said, I want to build you a permanent house for you to live. And then the Lord turned around and said, no, I want to build you a house. Now that can be a little bit confusing. Like, what does this house mean? David was looking to build God a temple, a place for him to live. And God was looking to build David a household. The descendants after him that he said David's descendants would have a king on the throne forever. Now this was a big deal, that his dynasty would continue, that his would be a kingdom that would last forever. Would be so exciting for David. It would be such an honor, because Saul's kingdom didn't last. His dynasty didn't last. God chose someone else. But in the faithfulness of God, he makes a covenant with David, and he says, no, your line will be established forever because you've followed me. And we see that play out. We'll see it in the next time period how the line of David continues. But the nation of Israel, in that way, didn't last forever. But we know later on in the story comes a man called Jesus, who we see is a descendant of David. We see this in Matthew chapter 1. There's a genealogy of Jesus. And he's descendant of the line of King David. And his kingdom is not like the kingdom of David in that it's an earthly kingdom and nation, but it's a heavenly kingdom that he brings. And that kingdom we are still living in today. Jesus is still reigning from the throne of heaven over that kingdom. And so we see that covenant promise of God fulfilled, that there would be a descendant of David on the throne forever. David was what is known as a type of Jesus. A type is a foreshadowing or like a picture of the things to come. So there are a lot of parallels between the life of David and Jesus that we can see. Both of them were born in Bethlehem, which is no great city. It was a humble town. Both of them were born of low standing on earth. Neither of their families were rich. They had no rank. By the world's standards, again, they weren't fit to be king. But both of them came from this low place. They were both shepherds. David spent the first years of his life taking care of sheep. And Jesus is a shepherd of souls. He says, I am the good shepherd in the book of John. Both David and Jesus were oppressed and persecuted, but did not open their mouths. David spent years on the run from Saul, who was after his life, who was looking to kill him because he felt threatened by him. Jesus was crucified. He was murdered for something that he was not guilty of. Yet he went because he knew that it was the plan of the Lord. Both waited on God to exalt them at the proper time. David was anointed while Saul was still king, and yet he waited to take that place until Saul had passed away. He knew that he had to wait on God's timing. And Jesus lived 30 years of life before even beginning a public ministry. And even then, he wasn't recognized. He waited on God to reveal to the people who he really was. So those are just a few things that we see that parallel in the lives of David and Jesus. So under David, the kingdom of Israel experienced their glory days, and he was seen as a type of the Messiah who was to come. Now, David had a son named Solomon, and this son was actually the son of Bathsheba, the woman with whom he committed adultery. And yet this is the one who became king after him. Now Solomon, while he was king, he asked God for wisdom, and he received it. He was the wisest man on earth. People from all around came to seek his wisdom. We actually have 3 books that we believe to be mostly authored by him in the Bible, which is Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. These 3 books full of wisdom from this man who asked for the wisdom of God. Solomon was the one to finally build the temple. David had sought to do this. He wanted to build a home for God, but God said it wasn't time yet. And under Solomon, that time came about. And this temple was full of symbolism of the Garden of Eden. There was trees, there were fruit. Just like the garden, it was a place for God's presence to dwell and to live among the people. However, Solomon did not follow all the directions set out by God about what a king should do. He began to marry many women from the surrounding nations, and they turned his heart towards their gods. He gained massive amounts of wealth and built a huge army. So God's instructions in Deuteronomy 17 said, "You shall not multiply horses. You shall not multiply wives, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself." The 3 things that God set out that a king should not do, Solomon did. And his heart became divided. He began to worship the gods of his wives above the Lord. And so God says, because you have done this, you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. So we see that this great kingdom of Israel is actually not doing so great. It's starting to break down because they're not following the ways of the covenant that they made with God. And we'll see more of the consequences of that in the next session on the divided kingdom.
Thanks, Caitlin, for sharing on Session 5 of the Bible Overview. For this week, we saw how God works with the choices of the kings to bring his redemption plan by establishing a covenant with David that his descendants will be on the throne forever. I loved Caitlin's comparison between David and Jesus, and so we have a visual for that in the highlight. Don't forget to check out the caption for questions that will lead to application of this week's topic, and I'm excited to introduce Chris, who will be sharing next week on how God works with the failures of the kings to bring about his redemption plan.